degrowth. And well, I'll just move straight on and say the talk will be recorded. I guess everyone heard that. And you can see the ICTA YouTube channel for that recording afterwards. So while Lorenz was at ETH Zurich, he developed an interest in modelling degrowth and post-growth climate mitigation scenarios. And now here at UNEL, he's supervised by Julia Steinberger, who's also in the little sidebar I think you'll see. And he's researching economic growth imperatives and dependencies. And today he'll give a concise summary of what seems to have been a massive literature review on this subject, which you can find in a recent paper in ecological economics, which I guess we can add to the chat as well. So I will pass over to Lorenz.
Thanks so much, Joel. I'm really happy to be here today with all of you. Thanks so much to the REAL project to provide me with this possibility. I'm not directly involved with REAL, but I'm a friend of REAL, so associated with the project, and I'm really happy to be here today with you and present to you the first PhD publication that I've produced in the frame of this research project. Cool, let's dive right into it. Today, first I'm going to start with what most of you probably already know, but why should we be concerned about economic growth in the first place? And what is the connection to growth dependencies and imperatives that I abbreviate with GDI? Just to set the scene for explaining a bit where this paper comes from and why I got interested in these questions to conduct this literature review on economic growth dependencies and imperatives. Why is this important at all? Then I'm going to explain a bit about the methods that we applied in the paper, coming directly to the results, giving you a short overview about the key points that I believe one can take from this exercise, then some discussion of the results, and also importantly the limitations of the paper, and a small outlook what comes next for me in terms of this PhD project and what you might can you expect from my further research projects. Nice. And then we're going to have some time for questions and discussions. So really eager to hear what you think, what your questions are, concerns, etc. Now, why economic growth? So as you might be familiar with in post-growth, degrowth literature, we sort of have this strong ecological critique of economic growth that we assume, or we propose, is most likely causally connected to the ecological crises. So not only is there a strong correlation between global GDP and the global material footprint, but also with, for instance, carbon emissions here in green. And even though there has been a relative decoupling on the global level, the periods where global carbon emissions actually declined have been periods of economic decline and economic crisis, economic reduction of GDP. But the ecological crisis is much bigger than that, and also includes, for instance, biodiversity loss, which can be more strongly linked to things like land use and material use more broader, which appear also to be strongly linked to economic growth. Voila. Now we know that some countries have achieved, for instance, absolute decoupling of GDP from carbon emissions, so GDP kept rising for these countries, whereas carbon emissions absolutely declined. However, this has been massively too slow to actually limit climate breakdown to some less dangerous levels, such as the 1.5 degree level. And as the following graph aims to sort of illustrate, also when we look in the future, so if we look at integrated assessment modeling of climate scenarios, economic growth makes this task much harder to achieve. For instance, on the left side, we have the common green growth mitigation logic. So in blue here is basically growth, aggregate services change, whereas the black dots here indicate the total net emission reduction that is achieved. And as you see, sort of this net growth that happens in the green growth modeling needs to be overcompensated strongly via these three mitigation levers: energy efficiency, negative emissions, where we suck carbon out of the air, and renewable energy. And these come with not only strong side effects, for instance, ecologically and other planetary boundaries, but also with feasibility concerns here shown in the shading. The brighter it gets, the higher are the feasibility concerns. To the right, there's the degrowth mitigation logic. So we have more or less stagnation of aggregate services and economic growth, or even a slight reduction. And via this, we need to compensate this change in economic growth. We need to compensate this much less with these technological levers. So less energy efficiency gains, less negative emissions, less renewable energy. So less side effects and fewer feasibility concerns. Voilà. Now, if we know that sort of less growth or if we would do the right things, so to protect the environment, to protect our livelihoods, and this would mean as a consequence, as a result, that we would have less production and consumption going on because we would consume and produce less and fewer bad things for the environment. Why aren't we pursuing these kind of changes? And there comes the point of growth dependencies and imperatives, basically. Because if we have currently periods of stagnation or even the reduction of economic activity, so reduction of production and consumption going on, then what we see is that there are very harmful social effects. For instance, here shown for the EU, we have in the last financial crisis, we had a strong reduction in GDP, but also massive reduction in employment. And we know that these are very harmful periods for many people who are affected by this. There's a rising threat of poverty, rising inequality, etc. Similarly, in the US, this is the unemployment rate in red, and the gray bars signify periods of GDP reductions, even very small ones. And we see a very strong response in the unemployment rate. Every time we have these GDP reductions, there's a spike in unemployment. And there are also other studies showing that, for instance, in countries and time periods with high propensity of government collapse, growth is significantly lower than otherwise. So during periods of economic stagnation, reductions in economic growth, something seems to be happening. And we really need to understand why this is happening. And here we come to GDIs, growth dependencies and imperatives. And the definition in the paper that I'm applying is these are mechanisms which cause negative consequences for the well-being of a group of agents in the absence, stagnation of economic growth on various levels. So this is basically shown here via some form of GDI mechanism. During these periods of stagnation, there's some harm to human well-being, which is then also used as a justification, as a growth driver for the pursuit of growth. Voilà. And this is the subject of this paper that recently has been published. And the problem basically is that we have many different proposals of these mechanisms, but they have strong implications. Different mechanisms have strong political and strategic implications for post-growth and degrowth because they imply how growth independence would look like. If we propose a specific mechanism of what causes GDI, we would need to overcome this mechanism, so change the mechanism so that we achieve independence of economic growth. The proposal of post-growth and degrowth is to achieve a social system, social structure, where we have well-being that is completely independent of economic growth, right? And for instance, in the degrowth literature, I would say there are many different strands, many different currents that I just briefly name here a few in this grid to structure it a bit. So whether it's compatible with capitalism, incompatible with capitalism, and whether the strategy implies taking state power or not. So firstly, we have, for instance, reformist strands, which view the changes that we need to achieve growth independence as compatible with capitalism, and this implies taking state power, for instance, via the normal parliamentary electoralist pathway, implementing reforms to reduce growth dependence. There are also strands within this reformist camp that in the end aim to overcome capitalism via these reforms, so they also might fit below rather. But there I put the rather sort of statist eco-socialist strand, which aims to overcome capitalism by taking state power, implementing more stronger reforms such as state ownership of the means of production or other measures such as price controls. And lastly, we have libertarian eco-socialism or eco-anarchism, which rejects taking state power and focuses more on bottom-up mobilization of the working class, for instance. So depending on which mechanism we believe causes growth dependence, we might choose one of these three groups or push for changes that are compatible with these three groups. But we currently had no systematic review of the proposed mechanisms, so we didn't have a full picture, or a rather full picture, of which mechanisms actually have been proposed. So yeah, this is basically what this paper is about. So the research question is, which clusters of theories of GDIs exist, and what are their theoretical disagreements and commonalities? Applying a methodology of systematic literature review following Sobercool et al. And the review approach starts with two pools of literature. So one, we take some recent reviews of the degrowth, post-growth literature, also specifically on growth imperatives, for instance, and look at the references, look at the citations, include sort of all papers that broadly discuss growth dependencies, always with a view on the negative consequences without growth. This is sort of the first iteration, broad scanning of titles, abstract, and text for GDI mechanisms. And the second pool supplements this because it's quite susceptible to our biases, right? If we start with what we know, recent reviews, etc., we supplement this with publications from Google Scholar and Web of Science, as well as references and citations of papers that we include in the review. So there was a tiny bit of snowballing there. In this first iteration, so all papers that actually broadly discuss GDIs, we come at 248 publications. And out of this, we include only those in the review that actually add a new GDI mechanism to the ones that we had already included from, for instance, the pool 1. So these arrive at 41 publications, and these we read in full and check for new additional mechanisms that actually add something to what we had already collected. And from there on, we categorize, write the mechanism summaries, and put the mechanisms in clusters, and the clusters again in themes, so super clusters basically, and carve out the commonalities and disagreements between the theories and clusters. So in terms of the results, we found 112 proposed claimed mechanisms for GDIs from these 41 references, grouped into 21 clusters and 6 overarching themes. And it must be said already here that we did not discriminate between mechanisms and theories, so we did not judge basically whether a mechanism makes sense or has empirical support or something like this. We just wanted to collect, okay, what is out there, what is being claimed, where GDIs come from. And this was basically how it looked like, a huge Excel file with lots of different categories. It's all in the appendix of the paper. If you want to dig deeper, there's tons of detail there. Now, this is basically a short overview and network of the 21 clusters that we found and the 6 themes. So fundamental economic structures, configuration, regulation of market competition, culture and ideology, the state, power and domination, the financial system, as well as miscellaneous, which we could not really attribute to different themes. And you really don't need to understand all these arrows. It's basically to show that there are causal connections between mechanisms. So some mechanisms claim to cause mechanisms in other clusters. So there's causal interlinkages between mechanisms and clusters. There are many commonalities between the mechanisms. So this is what this graph basically shows. The higher is the number of connections to these 5 common elements. For instance, we have 13 clusters that claim to cause accumulation, which under a situation of economic stagnation comes to the detriment of others. If some group accumulates, some other need to lose. And this is connected to inequality. 10 clusters cause labor-saving technological change, where under a situation of economic stagnation, labor is saved. So humans are replaced, for instance, by machines. And thus, when labor productivity rises under a situation of economic stagnation, then often you have unemployment if, for instance, working times are not reduced. So this includes also factors that prevent the redistribution of labor and income. Then 8 clusters cause various monetary, financial dynamics that lead to economic crisis without growth. And then we have the cultural and ideological factors that tie well-being to growth, as well as lastly, situations where human needs exceed various productivities. For instance, under population growth, when you have economic stagnation, but you have population growth and productivity of, for instance, energy and material inputs does not rise, then you might have deprivation of human needs, because the same economic pie needs to be distributed over a larger amount of people, for instance. And these all 5 elements cause various negative consequences for well-being without growth, for instance, including unemployment, bankruptcy, poverty, welfare state crises, etc. Now, I want to dive a bit to give you just an impression of some of the mechanisms that we found, to just show you the high variety of mechanisms that exist out there and the different levels on which they argue to exist, basically. For instance, Richters and Simonite, they focus a lot on the prevalence of cheap, abundant resources, which lead to a situation in a competitive market economy where firms and workers who compete with each other, they have a need to pursue labor-saving investments to actually replace, for instance, expensive labor power with cheaper machines and energy. So on a micro level, if we only look at the individual firm or individual worker, without growth, this leads to an economic competitive disadvantage, whereas on a macroeconomic level, through these labor-saving investments, as I just explained, it leads to unemployment without growth. Other authors, such as Colin Walker and Stratford, they focus more on the prevalence of private firm ownership, where owners have an incentive to accumulate profits for their own benefit and for their own power, which leads on a micro level to incentives to dismiss workers whenever it increases profits, for instance, in situations of economic uncertainty, and to net save, to actually accumulate money, as I said, for own benefits or to increase the competitiveness of the firm. And on a macroeconomic level, due to these net savings, so net removals of money towards owners and the rich, there's instability because money gets constantly removed out of the circulation. Whereas there's also unemployment without growth because owners have an incentive to fire workers when it benefits them. Lastly, Exner and Nelson focus more on the fundamental structure of the monetary economy, also synonymously market economy, which inherently leads to competition, uncertainty, structural distrust between people. So on a micro level, without growth, the firm, for instance, needs to accumulate money to ensure against this uncertainty including via increased exploitation of workers, for instance. And on a macro level, again, accumulation to ensure against uncertainty, leading to unemployment, instability without growth. Now, further examples, because it comes up a lot in the degrowth literature, the full-time work model. So if we don't reduce working times with these labor productivity gains, then we have unemployment without growth. So if we would adopt working time reductions and distribute working times differently, then you would not have these unemployment problems, for instance. That's the focus of this mechanism. Other authors focus on a completely different level, for instance, on the state geopolitical level, for instance, on military competition between states. So if we have military competition between states, then the state might need to foster growth, to have a surplus, economic surplus that can be invested in a stronger military to defend against imperialist rivals, but also to be more imperialistically successful itself, to foster its own power. And yeah, on a macro level then, without growth, there's a competitive disadvantage, and there might be a high risk of domination by another state or even direct military conquest. And lastly, there's also cultural, ideological growth dependencies, for instance, via positional competition, which is a situation where social status is tied to higher income and connectedly the possibility to buy positional goods, so goods that signal social success and social status. So if a person is sort of in this situation of positional competition and does not achieve an increased income over time, there is, again, a competitive disadvantage. Basically, the person cannot keep up with others that increase their social status. So decreased happiness and other strongly negative consequences, for instance, lower health outcomes, lower possibility to find romantic partners, etc. This can have many different levels. Cool. This is just to give you a short presentation of sort of the variety of mechanisms that we found. There's, of course, tons more in the paper. Now to the aspect of differences and conflicts. So the first thing that we found is, as you already noticed, maybe there's a lot different levels going on between micro, so on the firm and individual level, for instance, meso and macro levels. So where the lack of growth actually happens, and also the where the negative consequence happens. Another point is the intensity kind of negative consequence. There's lots of variety there, and some authors even argue that, for instance, the word imperative should only be applied to really, really bad consequences. So if we have existential consequences without growth, then it's an imperative. If it's just reduced happiness because people have consumerist ideology and they cannot buy the newest products anymore, then it's more of a growth driver or dependency. And lastly, of course, the key debate between additionality and exclusivity of mechanisms. So do some mechanisms work additionally to each other, so that they are active simultaneously and just worsen growth dependence? Or are really some mechanisms active and others really are not, so they exclude each other, and we can only have some or the others? So yeah, basically the question, which ones are active, how do they work together? And this concerns sort of that's what we found in the paper. A key question really is the neutrality or non-neutrality of fundamental social structures in causing GDIs. So do some of these social structures cause GDIs or not? For instance, market competition, the monetary economy, the state, private property, etc. So is a growth-independent market economy possible? Is the state subject to a GDI? Is private firm ownership causing a GDI? So quite fundamental questions for also how a growth-independent society should or would need to look like. This is just a Sankey diagram to show you the distribution and percentage of the mechanisms on the left side the growth variable, so the lack of which causes the negative consequence. And you see by far most of mechanisms, they propose that lack of GDP, gross domestic product, causes negative consequences. But there are also sizable groups around firm level net investments, profits, and firm level income consumption. And then on the right side, which harm is being caused under the situation of economic stagnation. So mostly unemployment and poverty, but also direct deprivation of human needs, bankruptcy on the micro level, decreased happiness, satisfaction with life, and financial instability in crises, or even domination and limitation of freedoms, some of the categories. And related to the question on political implications, growth independence, this is the graph basically where we assess which mechanism implies compatibility of a specific social structure with growth independence. So maybe it's easiest to explain this on an example. So 94% of mechanisms here on the left imply that you could reach growth independence with the structure of the state, so without overcoming the social structure of the state, whereas only 2% of mechanisms basically imply, okay, there is a GDI within the structure of the state, so you cannot have growth independence with the state. And then maybe that's most important is the bar to the very right. So all four structures together, 71% of mechanisms imply that you can maintain all these four structures, so state, monetary economy, market competition, and private property, and still have growth independence. So these are more the reformist camp that I showed in the beginning, compatibility between capitalism and these growth independence, whereas 23% imply really an incompatibility with that, so they imply much more radical social changes to actually achieve growth independence. So more the eco-socialist camp that I showed before. And what's important to note here is that sometimes it's not really clear how the definition of these terms is in the mechanisms proposed. So what is private property, for instance? It's not often made clear. So one needs to really make that explicit what one is talking about. Now to the discussion and limitations. So first of all, I want to say directly there are many limitations to the paper, many possibilities of biases for us, for instance, in the pool 1, which papers were included, which ones were not. I'm sure we have missed publications. That's always part of the game, but we try to minimize it, of course. Then the collection of mechanisms that we propose entails that we interpret and reformulate the mechanism proposed by the authors. So we might have misunderstood the formulations of authors or brought our own interpretations too strongly into the mix. To formulate a coherent mechanism, for instance. And lastly, again, I can only stress that we do not propose an assessment of merit. So we also include mechanisms that have been heavily criticized in the literature, for instance, the whole debate around interest-bearing money creation, interest-bearing debt. We do not exclude any mechanism based on what we think about it. Still, we really think that a wide review is an essential basis for a subsequently solid assessment of the theory's merits. So we really have to discuss, okay, which theories actually make sense, which are empirically supported. Because, as I said, depending on who's more correct in that theory of GDIs, this assessment can have strong implications for vision and strategy of the degrowth movement. And, for instance, some proposed changes could be ineffective in overcoming GDIs that the degrowth movement is currently pursuing, while others could be also more radical or more difficult than would be absolutely necessary to achieve growth independence. So I think we really need more debates and research on differentiating theories based on merit and explanatory power. So we should focus on increasing conceptual clarity, but also looking on empirical depth and width. So, for instance, case studies and many more looking into a wide range of empirical cases to look at where growth dependencies actually come from. Now, just last work on the outlook, what's next for me. So in the next papers, I'm working on sort of causally ordering the clusters and mechanisms that I showed you. So basically proposing a GDI theory that takes position on these non-neutrality questions that I raised of fundamental social structures and proposes a position on them. And of course, also a theory that I think has some merit, has some explanatory power in terms of empirical cases. And the last project is spelling out then the political and strategic implications for post-growth and degrowth of such a theory. Yeah, but that's all very much work in progress. And just a heads up, so you know what's coming, and I really look forward to hearing what you think about this paper, what you think about the topic of growth dependencies. So yeah, voila.
Thank you hugely, Lorenz.
Should I stop the sharing?
Yes, probably. Okay. So perfectly to time, well done. So now on to questions. In the interest of giving the gender balance a head start, I'm going to start with Malena's question from the chat. And they ask, well, first they say thanks for sharing your research, very interesting and insightful. And they're wondering, in which clusters do you place countries and markets from the global south and their growth dependencies, if there is anything specific for those regions? Do you want to do one at a time, or do you want to take two more?
I personally prefer one at a time.
One at a time, okay, go for it.
Cool. Thanks so much for this question. I think it's a great question. So the theory, so the paper was really focused on, all kinds of mechanisms that we could find. And as far as I remember, we did not find a proposed mechanism sort of specifically for global south countries. But several mechanisms, I think, can be of relevance for global south countries. For instance, I mean, the first one I think about is this discussion about geopolitics and military competition, as well as economic competition between states. So, for instance, there's one mechanism that focuses on capital flight. So when a country does not give prosperous expectations to capital and prosperous conditions for private investment, then that capital has an incentive to flee that country, or to kind of punish that country through its flight. So yeah, there's, I guess, in terms of pressure for countries to provide good conditions for capital to exploit their own workers. That might be a mechanism which is interesting. Generally, also mechanisms on introduction of sort of historical introductions of colonial structures of private property and the state might also be relevant for global south countries. Yeah, that's what comes to mind for me right now. But yeah, I guess many of the mechanisms can be relevant as far as the social structures and ideologies, cultures are shared in several different countries. So yeah, I think that could be a next step, right? An empirical assessment of, for instance, which of the mechanisms apply more to global south versus global north countries.
Thank you. So on to Vlad now.
Thank you, Lorenz, for this great presentation. It was very interesting. In regards to the diagram that shows the various connections between these GDIs, that diagram seems to suggest some sort of a uniform causal structure between the GDIs, and perhaps it hints at the supra-causal structure that may have to do with the design of capitalism of some sort. So in reviewing the literature, have you noticed like a single causal structure? Like, for example, a Markovian chain between all these GDIs, and do you get the sense there is a causal suprastructure to all these GDIs?
Thanks for this question, Vlad. So yeah, I mean, I would not say that we have discovered the causal structure behind all the mechanisms. I mean, it's also some of these are obviously or are clearly incompatible with each other. So whereas some mechanism claims that, for instance, market competition is the problem, others say it's really the monetary economy itself. So I guess you could make a case for a complete additionality of mechanisms where you really propose that all of them are active at the same time, and then you would still need to sort of causally order them. So which one is primary, or yeah, which one comes first, and this would basically imply the adoption of a specific theoretical perspective. So, for instance, an anarchist would have a different view on that than a Marxist or a liberal state theorist. So they would reject and adopt different kinds of mechanisms. So yeah, I think you would need to kind of take a stance there to actually propose an actual causal chain that you think is the one that is actually driving growth dependency. So you cannot get around these kind of discussions, I think.
Thank you. So we have one more question in the chat. Feel free to keep adding to the chat if people find that easier. That's often what I do myself. So from Elena, can you share some ideas on what implications your study has for post-growth strategies? So what stance should we take on growth dependencies, and how do we deal with these dependencies on growth while designing a political economic post-growth strategy?
Thanks for this question. So I think that kind of relates more to the second PhD project I'm currently pursuing, because there I'm trying to actually kind of propose a specific perspective on which mechanisms are more important, are active actually in our societies and or different time periods as well. And from this, then I think you can make a concrete implication of strategy and vision of a post-growth society. So, I mean, again, based on this first paper, I cannot really say a lot, but for instance, if you propose that the state causes a growth dependency, for instance, because there's a political ruling class that benefits from accumulation, economic growth for its own benefit to maintain its power, but also to invest in a strong military, so to dominate other countries and pacify internal social conflict via something like an imperial mode of living, then the implication would be, for instance, that a degrowth project that aims to take power in the state be it via a political party project or via a revolutionary coup d'etat, taking power in the state via that, would encounter significant barriers to implementing its program because it would not remove the actual cause of GDIs, right? In that case, the state. Whereas if you only propose, only the private firm ownership in a competitive market environment, that's where growth dependencies come from, then you might say, we take power in the state and we expropriate capitalists and we impose state ownership of the means of production, and then we have overcome this growth dependency, allowing for strategies such as mass party line, that some degrowthers such as Jason Hickel have recently proposed. So I think it depends there again what are the implications, but these are crucial discussions and we need to have them.
Great. So I think Morten in the chat was next in the list, and then on to Yona. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. So Morten says, thanks for your great work. Yeah, I guess these are going to maybe have some similar answers. So based on an educated guess, which three growth dependencies do you think are the strongest and most likely to hold water empirically?
Oh wow. Yeah, okay. So I mean that very much relates to the second paper. Personally, I mean the theory that I will try to propose is basically a theory of growth dependence of social domination exploitation. So I basically think that social structures of domination and exploitation cause growth dependencies via being connected to accumulation and inequality, for instance. And this to me very much includes the state. So if we say that that the state can be conceived of as a massive power hierarchy, where some people control the means of coercion via military, police, courts, etc., prisons, then that is a mechanism that is extremely strong, that also relates to the economic dimension, of course, with private property, market competition, monetary economy. So basically my stance is that these structures that I mentioned before, with a discussion of non-neutrality, they are all non-neutral. So they all cause growth dependency, together as the system, self-reinforcing, mutually reinforcing system of capitalism. And to have a fully growth independent system, you would need to have a system of economic and political self-governance with some form of decentralized economic planning that is not anymore pursued via the market mechanism, monetary mechanisms, etc. So basically overcoming the state and private property. That's sort of my view. And I think if we look at, for instance, historical statist socialist experiences, there's a lot of empirical support for these kind of perspectives. With in these countries the sort of socialist party elite forming new ruling classes that accumulate on the back of the working class. That's basically the proposition I would make. But of course, many people would see this differently and would order it differently, or would disagree with many points of that.
So outside of the chat, back now to Jonah.
Hi, can you actually hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect, great. Well, first of all, thanks for the presentation. It's great to hear about the updates on the research. I was wondering, just from at some point linking all of this back to the elements of political feasibility and the type of discussions we need to have, particularly in the reformist camp of the arena, if you want to put it like that. I'm always interested in, can we break down the system boundary in that sense, right? The economy, right? Or the global economy, can we break that down and link it back to provisioning system logic, right? Because when we look at it from, for example, from a material requirement point of view, it's really food, housing, mobility, and energy. Let's take out energy, but it's those four that really drive, I think it was 90% of material demand across income groups, like countries, across geographies, and so on, right? So I'm always wondering, if I now take this and I was about to go to some transport minister, right, or to an urban development city level planning, like let's broaden our field of arenas by having more nuances of provisioning systems. Is that something you discover in your analysis going forward, maybe even in the research now, where we find growth dependencies, maybe even different mechanisms grouped by sector or by provisioning system? Because then I feel we have both sides of the coin. We have the top-down logic, but we also have the needs assessment, so we can have a stronger case for delinking economic growth from these systems. I'm just curious what's the outlook, and if there's maybe papers to learn more about this.
Thanks so much for this question. There's absolutely literature on specific sectors and provisioning systems. So I mean, it's an emerging literature. So it's really there's a lot remains to be done. But I would highly recommend the work from Zu Ermgassen et al. They have published a paper on the housing sector, for instance, and discussed growth dependency in the British housing sector, as well as the work of Christine Corlett-Walker, who works on the old age care public sector and growth dependence within the welfare state. So there is a lot emerging on the welfare state and growth dependence in the welfare state. Yeah, and on other sectors, I'm not really aware. There recently was a paper on growth imperatives in the aviation sector. I always forget the name. But yeah, I think if you check aviation and growth imperatives, you couldn't find it. And yeah, so there definitely is being work done, and we cover some of this in the paper.
Okay.
But for instance, there will also be quite soon a review on growth dependency in the welfare state by Milena Büchs, so look out for that at our.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks a lot for the guidance.
Great. So back to the chat. Judith has an unstable internet connection, so has left a question here. And they're wondering about the definition you gave of mechanisms, and must these growth dependencies affect a specific actor's well-being? Does actor here just mean groups of people or somewhat organized actors? And what conceptions of actor were out there in the literature?
Thanks. That's a very good question. So we tried to really have a broad definition here. We try to include all kinds of impacts on some degree of well-being, very broadly defined. But yeah, actor in our conception means broadly groups of people, always some people, but it could also mean, for instance, organizational collapse of a firm. But then we try to always make it explicit how this connects to human well-being. So for instance, if a firm collapses, then you could argue, okay, that's not actually a problem if all the people that become unemployed, they get rehired. So the unemployment really is the problem, or the reduction in monetary income, or the psychological effects. Stuff like that, but we just try to be explicit there, but also include a broad variety of impacts and actors, and that can also include, for instance, the state or groups of states. I hope that explains it, but so you can see also in the graph that I showed, there were many different kinds of impacts depending on also impacts on, for instance, freedoms and psychological effects, not only physical. Yeah.
Great. I think we do have 10 minutes left. So if there's any more questions, now's the time. Yeah. Back to Jonah.
Yeah, sorry, I don't participate in these events too often, so when I get the chance to ask 2 questions, forgive me for that. Look, I mean, as an outsider, outside of the academic bubble in that sense, all of this, it's super exciting. I'm really excited about all of this stuff, specifically in real, and the funding it got, and then kind of the type of legitimacy it brings to the whole endeavor of this coming out of the niches of the camp, right? So my question is always, like, is there something like, maybe this is not the right form to ask this, but is there something like a bubble, a kind of an accelerator to derive political implications that as this new research, new insights come live, right, we can incorporate this almost in real time. So we don't have to wait for 4 years for the conclusion of this project, and then in typical fashion, we go into the exploitation phase, and now we bring this to people, because just in the sense of urgency, particularly on this topic, it's just so there's so many good nuggets and so many insights that are really countering a few common imperatives that are out there in the political space right now, particularly in Europe, right? So I'm wondering, are there plans, are there vehicles, are there groups that are thinking about how do we bring this now into the political discourse, like right now, right? Okay, how do we have a distributed network of people that can make that happen in a way? So in a way, how do we bring all of this from the academic bubble to the real life, let's say, sorry, not to real life, but like the political conversations on this very topic, right? Because case in point, I was just reading about automotive phase out, and it just becomes so, I would say, unscientific these days that, and the common denominator is always competitiveness and jobs, right? And this research really tackles into that type of narrative. Like, how do we get better together at making this come to life, right? What you're finding here.
Yeah, I mean that's a huge question. I mean the scientific mills are very slow in terms of output. So yeah, I think within Real there are projects going on in terms of outreach, in terms of also lobbying in the European Union and Brussels. As well as these seminars here, basically. I mean, okay, in the public seminars, they usually we discuss published work that is in that sense also rather robust or rather well treated in that sense. So yeah, I guess maybe here it could be good to of course have the personal links with people in projects such as Real, but I think many people of Real are also active in social movements and activist groups that are more related to directly bringing these kind of results into strategizing into movements, etc. So maybe it's best to link up and network with these kind of associations. That's kind of the thought I have right now. But also within Real, I think we're having this discussion of course, how to link up with activists and change makers, so to speak, who want to benefit from that.
Okay, cool. No, thanks for sharing. And I think it's just like, I mean, I understand that the whole the research here, this goes beyond Europe, right? It's just, it feels like Europe is really a hot testing bed right now from a case study point of view for the movement to actually, I feel like the arena is there right now, right? So let's try to bring it. Anyways, thanks for your reflection on this. And maybe we can stay connected on this content. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we do have another question in the chat, but it's very long, so I'm trying to catch up with it, and I think it only just came in. So maybe I should just read it out. So it is from Jocelyn at ETH, and they're wondering, when talking about economic growth, and it's linked to ecological crisis, the scope is material footprint or carbon emissions. But also biodiversity is well implicated within the capitalist economy. And so they are wondering if anyone's considering how growth dependencies also affect how we do conservation.
Yeah, that's an interesting and big question, which I haven't thought about this a lot, I think. So also anyone in the audience, if somebody wants to reply on that, is more implicated in, for instance, conservation, I would be happy to hear about it. But I mean, I agree with you that biodiversity conservation sector is well implicated within the capitalist economy, and it's often about sort of this control and purification almost of nature, right? Keeping humans out more or less in some protected areas. That is very much implicated again with state violence and surveillance and stuff. I'm not sure how to spontaneously now connect it to growth dependencies. I could imagine that, it's also in that sense growth dependent, that as soon as there's a higher necessity for growth and accumulation, conservation efforts in these directions might also be either cut or done in a way that is cheaper or less qualitatively useful and good. So I don't know, for instance, right now here in Switzerland, we have in the canton Vaud, where I'm based, there's lots of struggle and strikes around cuts in the public sector. in favor of military budget and redistribution to the top on the federal level. So I could imagine that something similar could also happen with conservation and general sustainability efforts. Once the pie is stagnating or shrinking, these are the projects that are cut the first. Yeah, as a parallel. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I don't see any more questions. Maybe in the interest of going under by a couple of minutes rather than over by a couple of minutes, we could stop there. There are a couple of comments on that last exchange in the chat. One being, I guess, paradoxically, you can kind of have capitalism driving biodiversity crisis, but also state-violence and market-based approaches to conservation being exactly the opposite. And I think that's the main point. There is another one further down. People might want to catch up with the chat if they want more of a insight into that exchange anyway. But otherwise, are you happy to finish that?
Yeah.
Do you want to field one more quick question?
If there are no more questions.
If someone thinks they can ask a question in 1 minute that has a 2-minute answer, then go for it.
Hi, could you just re-summarize the key takeaways? Just in summary, this is what I want you to know.
The key takeaways of my presentation?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, that's difficult. So I guess key takeaways is that growth dependency imperative mechanisms that we found, they are more numerous and more heterogeneous than we previously expected. So they are not only on an economic level, but are being proposed to be not only on an economic level, but also, for instance, political, geopolitical, state level, as well as cultural, ideological aspects that we need to discuss and be aware of. We need more research, more discussion on differentiating theories based on merit and explanatory power of empirical cases. And what else? Yeah, these have very important political and strategic implications for the post-growth and degrowth movement, depending on which sort of theoretical school of thought, which theoretical strand of GDIs we follow in the end, varying between reformists, eco-socialists, eco-anarchist visions, for instance, and strategies.
Perfect. So we end there after electronic applause, if you want.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
You can log out.